So again, welcome to all, also to those who just joined us for the afternoon at that annual meeting of the Geneva Human Rights Platform. And we are now moving into the next session. And as I said before, connectivity cannot just be discussed in the abstract, but looking at current topics, at issues. And so this morning, for those who just joined us, we heard a keynote by Sarah Cleveland, who gave us insight on what connectivity means in human rights law and policy, and also how to enhance it between treaty bodies in the wider UN human rights system and also with regional human rights mechanism. The next session set the stage and provided for an overview of different mechanisms and their characteristics, looking into peer review mechanisms also beyond the UPR, looking at the anti-corruption and world trade systems. And then a second session focused on the particular issue of the link of various human rights mechanisms and the SDGs. And now this afternoon will be dedicated to a look into the area of civil society space and reprisals. And then a session on the more theoretical question of lawmaking by human rights bodies. And I was happy to also share with the panelists of this session now that the morning sessions also looked a lot into civic space, into participation, and so I think it links really neatly with what we discussed in the morning to see also what human rights bodies can contribute to that area. And with this, I would like to hand over to Michael Ineichen from the International Service for Human Rights partner on that panel.
Thank you very much, Felix, and thank you to the Academy for partnering with us on to put on this panel on civil society space and reprisals. For those of you who were here in the morning, you will have seen, and those who weren't, I'll tell you now how important really the participation and the engagement of civil society was seen to be if we want to increase the connectivity and the connections between different human rights mechanisms. And so I think it's really timely and opportune that we're having this discussion so prominently on the agenda today. I'm going to briefly introduce the panelists and propose to you how we will structure this conversation. I would really like to have it as a conversation rather than a lecture by the panelists and a brief moment at the end. So we'll take it in two parts. The first part will focus on civil society space and engagement, participation of civil society at national level, and what the role is that the panelists and the audience see in terms of international human rights mechanisms supporting that participation, but where the participation, the space of civil society is taking place at the national level. In the second part, and there will be a moment for interaction on this aspect of the problem, or of the challenge. The second part, we will look at the international dimension, so what's the state of affairs in terms of space, participation, engagement of civil society within those international human rights mechanisms, of which we have many representatives and experts here. And again, there will be a moment of interaction after that. So we're taking the national level first, international level second. I'm joined here on the panel by four distinguished panelists. To my right, we have Michael Gaffey, who's the permanent representative of Ireland to UNOG here in Geneva. To my left, Peggy Hicks, who's the Director of Thematic Engagement, Special Procedures and the Right to Development Division at OHCHR. To the far left, we have Virginia Bras-Gomez, who is the former chair of the Committee of Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, but even more importantly, a long-time member of that committee, as she told me before. And then to our right, we have Susan Wilding, who's heading the head of the Geneva office of Civicus, who also has the caption below. Its name is the World Alliance for Citizen Participation. So thank you also, Susan, for being with us and sharing your expertise on this topic today. In order to wake everybody up from the post-lunch sommeil, I'm going to do actually something that I was curious to see in the morning as well. I'm going to poll the audience so that we can see what kind of representation of different stakeholders we have in the room. So when I read out your stakeholder group, may I ask you to raise your hand so that we can get a bit of a visual of what stakeholders we have in the room. So who is representing a state here in the room? But raise your hand so that we can actually see it. Okay, so that's maybe a third, a quarter. Academic institutions, yeah, about similar. Media, 2. Thank you. It's great that this event is also attracting media attention. And then civil society. Great, so that's a small majority, I think, of civil society. I didn't read out NHRIs, but that's my omission. Are there any other NHRIs other than Stephen from the Danish Institute? Great, so that gives us all a feel of who's in the room. I'm now going to ask you a second question, and that is, if you put yourself you think of your own country, so my country would be Switzerland, and you reflect on the participation of civil society in policy lawmaking in your country at national level first, or at international level. And the question to you is, where is there more participation? Is there more participation of your civil society nationally, or is there more participation of your civil society internationally? And those who won't raise their hand, they think it's more or less equal. So who thinks that in my country there is more participation at national level of civil society? Great, that's probably about a third. And who thinks that it's at international level where civil society of my own country is more active? There's only about 3 of them. I think that does also give us a feel of the audience. If I would have asked this question with our usual constituency, which are human rights defenders, I think the majority would have raised their hand on the second prompt. So in terms of participation at international level, that's much more important. And I think that shows why we felt it's critical to have a conversation during the Academy's annual dialogue on the space for civil society and how are we doing. Now, with that little poll, I'm going to launch into the panel here, and I'll first turn to you, Ambassador Gaffey. I'd be really interested to know, what is Ireland doing at home through its diplomatic missions to ensure that your own civil society can fully participate in human rights policy, both at home but also internationally? What are you doing at the moment?
Well, thank you very much, Michael. And it's good to be the starter. If hopefully everybody isn't asleep yet, and hopefully they won't be asleep by the time I've finished speaking. But no, I think the first thing I'd say, I was just thinking that if I polled people in Ireland about what is civil society space, I think there might be a low level of understanding of that term. But yet, if I polled people in Ireland, do you think that civil society are more active, more influential, and more effective in promoting and achieving change? I think everyone would understand it, and there would be a very strong positive answer. We've had, and in a way, we find ourselves in the mission and operating internationally, taking a certain leadership role on civil society space for a number of years in the Human Rights Council, but also responding to what's happening at home, because there have been really big developments in Ireland in terms of change, social change and social issues. And to be honest, and that's over the last 20 years, but especially in the last 5 to 10 years. And that has been led, frankly, by civil society. If we had waited for the official side, as it were, like we're the officials and the politicians and the government, to propose and push certain issues, I'm not sure we would not have got the level of change that we have got. Now, the government knew there was a growing appetite, the country was changing. And to get certain things changed in Ireland, you need to change the constitution. I mean, no divorce was in the constitution. No abortion was in the constitution. Marriage equality required a constitutional change. And that requires a referendum. I think where people really found their voice was in the marriage equality referendum. That's where it became evident to everyone that there was a movement there. Because the marriage equality referendum was backed by all the parties, some in a half-hearted way, some not. But the reason it was such a massive success was because organisations, but also just young people, pulled themselves together intergroups to influence each other, to bring each other home to vote, to tell stories. And that was seen as a massive success of, I suppose you'd call it civil society organisation. Mm-hmm. It was people themselves who delivered that change to the government and the political parties. And they found a voice and a sense that they could change things without having to work exclusively through the political parties, but working with them also. And that's why I would say that the Eighth Amendment on abortion passed, again, massively, in a way that had not been expected. But what the but I just...
Excuse me to interrupt you here. Has there been any... How has the state supported that level of organisation?
Well,
I think that would be...
the state actually did support it, I think, without fully understanding how effective it might be. Right. Because in order to, the government wanted to look at reform in the Constitution. What areas do you want to change? The Constitution was the second Constitution but of the independent state in 1937. So a lot has changed between 1937 and 2017, 18, 19. So in order to look at what areas might be changed, and in a way to avoid divisive political debate, the government put together a citizens' assembly. So a random selection of citizens from the electoral register and so on was pulled together, and they actually voted on what should be put to the people. And there was a sense that it had all, in the media initially, that it had all gone wrong because the change that they wanted and they suggested seemed to be way beyond what was being said in Parliament, and there was a sense that maybe this is an unrepresentative group, except that the referendums held since then have reflected that. So that citizens' assembly has been a huge success. But I would say that all of this is based on a newfound respect for and understanding of the importance of citizens' voices, and it has come through education and debate. It has come through our peace process with Northern Ireland, followed by our economic boom, and then our very quick economic collapse. So that the shock to the system, I think, brought people out into expressing their views, still through political parties, but also by organising with each other, and we feel that here in Geneva too.
Excellent. Thank you, Ambassador. Just one quick follow-up. To what extent do you think that international human rights mechanisms, the machinery, the plethora of mechanisms that we all know exists, how have they supported Irish civil society in having its voice heard, in making sure that those demands get heard?
Well, you know, a lot of the big issues in Irish society that we've had to confront in the last 5 to 10 years have actually been highlighted by treaty bodies and special procedures and visits to Ireland. So what I always say is, when we are urging other states to cooperate with the mechanisms and to have a standing invitation to special rapporteurs to visit Ireland, I think the important convincing point that we need to make is that a lot of the issues that we weren't comfortable facing up to were brought to our attention by UN human rights mechanisms. And the media picked them up, and people picked them up. So there has been, issues such as the Magdalen laundries, mother and babies' homes, really uncomfortable, difficult issues from relatively recent history, I think would not have been confronted without that external examination and highlighting. And then that enabled people to gather their forces in order to kind of push. And the government has always needed to be pushed a bit. And I also said to someone the other day in my own office that, we get so many questionnaires from Peggy's colleagues, endless questionnaires. You think sometimes, oh my God, are people at home going to answer these? But I'm amazed they are answering them, they are replying to them, and they do have an effect in highlighting important issues. And I think one of the reasons is that there is a respect in Ireland for the UN, but not necessarily such a respect that you answer every single questionnaire. I think most importantly is that civil society, the media, and people most involved will respond and react if we're not cooperating. So I think there's a synergy there that for the moment is working really well. And people say that Ireland we seem to buck the trend at all times when the world is liberalising and looking to the globe and interdependence, we had a tendency to look in on ourselves. When we saw the consequences of our own issues and problems. Now we are in a wave that somehow seems to be going the other way elsewhere. So hopefully,
thank you for bucking the trend.
Hopefully, we can continue to buck the trend and not in a bad way.
Thank you. It's an excellent segue to my question to Susan to bring you in here. The Civicus Monitor, which is your tool that documents the state of civil society in the world, lists that 6 out of 10 countries have restricted space. What does that mean? So how does one live in restricted space? And how is Civicus using international human rights mechanisms to push back against that? How are you trying to unrestrict that space?
Thank you, Michael. And thank you, Ambassador, for bucking the trend. We hope that continues, because we are seeing, unfortunately, a trend towards a restriction of civic space. And we see it through our own evidence base, but we also see it through our membership alliance. Civicus has 7,000 members across the globe, and so we have a very good source of information from a national level globally. And so we see it anecdotally as well of the civic space shrinking. But I just wanted to sort of set the scene on what we, at least at Civicus, define civic space to be, so that there's an understanding that citizen participation is an element of that, or ideally the outcome of an open civic space. And so for Civicus, the civic space is the protection in law and practice of 3 fundamental freedoms: the freedom of expression, the freedom of association, and the freedom of peaceful assembly. And we see those 3 freedoms as the gateway to many, many other human rights achievements, to development, etc. And so when we look at what civic space restrictions are, we look at a national level legal restrictions. So when states implement laws that restrict the operations of civil society, whether that be laws that impede their accreditation or their right to function, their access to funding, etc. And we also look at like the increase of criminalization of legitimate activity on the ground, so legitimate activists or humanitarian workers even who are being criminalized by the state. And then we also see a large trend of extra-legal measures or restrictions on civil society, and they include public vilification, where high-ranking officials run smear campaigns against activists, unwarranted surveillance, and threats of violence are 3 of the most prominent ways that we see the restriction on civil society. And so to answer Michael's question as well, is interesting the hands going up, that most people in this room feel that nationally they have more engagement. And that's really great, but what we see, the trend, especially in the global south, but equally nowadays in the west as well, and the global north, is that citizens have no access to their own policymakers at a national level. And so they face restrictive policies, and then they have no access, as Ambassador was pointing out, how civil society could really engage with the Irish government. And so many of our members have no ability to do that. There's no framework, they just can't. So they turn to the international mechanisms for that engagement. And so we see the importance of the UN, especially and its mechanisms, in playing that role for civil society to have access to at least policy making at an international level, and a protection mechanism as well for those that cannot speak out in their home countries. I just wanted to also touch on... just on the element of that's something that we haven't spoken about, where the UN, I think, can play a really important role, is we see that trust is probably the biggest impediment to citizen engagement at a national level. Mistrust between governments and civil society has grown, and even between international bodies and civil society and private sector and civil society. And I think the UN and its mechanisms could play a really important role in being a trust broker at a national level as well. So, yeah.
Thank you, Susan, and I think we're gonna hold that last thought as well in terms of the trust. But I first want to turn to Virginia, who, as I said, has for many years worked with the Committee on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights. Oh, sorry, microphone. Now, the way that Susan has characterized civic space or civil society has an emphasis on freedom of expression, freedom of assembly, participation. How, in your practice, looking at the implementation of a covenant that doesn't have freedom of expression, freedom of assembly at its core, how, in your practice, have you contributed to creating space for civil society at national level? Because I know you did. How did you do that, and why did you do that, given that that's not the core mandate of SESCA?
Well,
to put that a little bit provocatively.
thank you, Michael. Yes, it's not the core mandate, but we are strong believers that both sets of rights can't be seen per se. They do link. And we have plenty of examples in the north and in the south where when they don't link, it really undermines the entire human rights effort. So I think where the committee has been probably more vocal is on recommending to states to create more structured spaces for civil society to be able to participate institutionally, not ad hoc efforts, but institutionally. And towards now the last years, I think we at times did refer to the national mechanisms for reporting and follow-up and how they could become also a good avenue for this structured relationship with civil society. If you give me a minute, my own example in Portugal is that we have a national mechanism for reporting and follow-up, and it's an inter-ministerial body, but in the legislation that creates the body, one of the mandates is to have 3 mandatory meetings with NGOs every year. And for that, we have the NGOs pick the subject of the theme they want for the meeting. So that has led to, and I think there are other examples like this, but this is one of the examples where I think at national level it's important to pursue the efforts that at the international level the committees can make, but then it's only what it is if it doesn't have any, any follow-up on the ground. The other thing I think is what perhaps what we try to do, I don't know if we were very successful, but I think we try to blur a little the difference between an advocacy NGO and a service delivery NGO. Because really, this adversarial relationship of the state with the advocacy NGOs is sometimes a misperception on what the NGOs really could do. And so we try to, since economic, social, and cultural rights, very much the goods and services for the realization of economic, social, and cultural rights are now more and more decentralized, and the more and more of the responsibility of the subnational level and the service delivery NGOs. We try to make it clear that if the delivery NGOs had proper human rights training and awareness in terms of keeping what we call the 3AQ framework, if the goods and services were accessible, if they were available, if they were good quality, and for that, of course, the NGOs needed human rights training, awareness, funding, policy guidance, etc. I don't know how successful we were or if we will be, but that is something we tried as a way to counteract this excessive politicization of the role of NGOs. To say that an advocacy NGO is not necessarily totally different from an NGO that provides quality services and services that are compliant with human rights obligations. What else did we do? I think we also, especially after the entry into force of the optional protocol, I think we try to call attention to the fact that NGOs can be good promoters of access to justice, because the grassroots NGOs are more in connection with lived injustices of people under different areas. And therefore that we should recognize the role and provide also support for NGOs to be instrumental in providing avenues, at least in opening people up, in disseminating the OP, in trying to make their proximity to people a good instrument of strengthening access to justice. I think I will keep there because there's something else I would like to, but I'll keep for the second round.
It's really excellent that you raised some really interesting issues. Thank you, Virginia. In time, if we do have time, it would be really interesting to come back to this distinction, or that you try to break down between the service delivery NGOs and the advocacy NGOs, which I think makes total sense if you listen to it like this, and it kind of provides an avenue for SESCA to then also create more space for civil society. At the same time, I think there's risks involved with that, because what I think maybe Susan can speak to in a minute, there's also challenges that come for these civil society actors if they suddenly start to be seen not as as service delivery, but as advocacy groups. So really interesting question there to raise. Peggy, you're leading the efforts of OHCHR to really reflect on how you're working and supporting civil society, how you're defending this space for civil society at national level. Can you tell us a little bit about where your thinking is currently going, and what you see as the potential of OHCHR and maybe the UN as a whole to contribute to that?
Thanks, Michael. Yeah, we have really given, I think, quite a bit of thought to these issues, and it's a conversation that's happening both within our organization and across the UN. I just came back from Rome, where there was the expert group meeting on SDG 16, and there was a huge focus on civil society participation and human rights within that conversation, understandably so if it's SDG 16. But I think that the climate has changed somewhat, and I see our role as pushing it to change even more. What that has meant from an OHCHR standpoint is that we undertook in our current strategic plan to undertake what we've called a shift towards defending civic space. And that represents the fact that we knew always that engaging in support of civil society and engaging with civil society is a core part of our mandate. Every single one of our field presences, if you ask what they do, they would say this is one of the important things they do. But one thing we hadn't done is that we hadn't really seen it as its own separate overarching priority. We haven't linked up those field presences to be able to make them to work more effectively together. And we perhaps haven't been as strategic as we could be about how we use our global role in protecting civic space. So we made a commitment that we would do more on that in this 4-year strategic plan, based on the fundamental premise that our office is always going to be a small office. You've all heard the small percentage of the UN budget that we get. But how we make change in human rights has to be about the work that is done at the national and local level by other actors. And so that if our office can play even a small role in opening up the space for their voices to be heard and for them to engage more effectively, that's the multiplier effect. That's the ripple effect that allows our office to truly be effective on human rights globally. Fortunately, that conversation that we are having within our own organization has really resonated within similar trends within the UN as a whole, and the Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, has been very interested in looking at how we better defend civic space, and has hosted and had a number of conversations on this, really looking across the UN system. Do we have the right sort of strategy in place? Are we being consistent from agency to agency in terms of what we do to look at our role with civil society? One of the key themes that we've brought into that conversation as OHCHR is that there does tend sometimes to be a tendency within the UN to think of participation. Like, do we, have we had the meeting with civil society? Do we have a civil society person in this event? But instead, they haven't really seen the need for protecting civic space as a fundamental precursor to that participation being effective. Giving somebody a seat at the table doesn't work if they're too afraid to come to the table, or if they, having been at the table, suffer a reprisal, or if they can't get the funding to allow them to have the programming that allows them to have an input into the table that makes sense. So seeing that protection element as a responsibility, not just something that the Human Rights Office ought to care about, but that is a fundamental part of our work in development and peace and security as well, is part of the cultural shift that we're trying to make happen within the UN system. When we look at, I'll just say sort of 4 general areas, and we can come back to any of these, of what this means in practice, what we're trying to do. One of the things we're looking at as an office is protection networks. How do we better support engagement across human rights actors within societies to allow them to do what they do more effectively? What we see, of course, is that some of those that are under threat are groups that don't identify as human rights defenders necessarily, environmental activists, land rights, other areas where people are really in danger, but they might not even connect up to some of the traditional human rights groups. So how can we better network people or assist in getting them networked in a way that can support them better? The second piece I'd mention, which of course is the theme of the overall meeting, is really looking at the role of the mechanisms. There's so much work that's done by the treaty bodies, the special procedures, and of course the UPR plays a critical role here as well. How can we use those tools better to better support and push for more to happen on civic space? So that's the standard setting role, that's the monitoring role, and it's really, from our office perspective, finding a way to make sure that what happens in the treaty bodies and the special procedures doesn't stay there, that it translates into a program of action, not just for our office, but for all of us in a broader sense. The third area, and I actually brought our little book here, there's a couple of them there. We've been working on participation guidelines. This is a project that was initiated through a Human Rights Council resolution, but really looking at how do we better give states guidance on how they ensure real participation in public affairs by civil society. What are the precursors? What are the foundations for that? How do we get states to do it better? And this is one of the products of that work. And then finally, as many of you will have heard me say, in fact, in this very room prior to this, we're looking at the online side of this, the digital side of what it means to better protect civic space and human rights defenders, and what can we do both in terms of bringing better technology, better assistance and support on how we use and harness technology to support civic space and human rights defenders, but also what are the new ways in which civil society is under attack through technology, and what can we as an office do to really hold people accountable for that and put solutions on the table that will allow us to address those attacks better.
Thank you very much, Peggy, for this outline of what you're currently doing, and also sharing that there's kind of bigger processes on the way that look at how the UN as a whole is engaging with civil society and understanding civil society. I'd like to now open the floor for questions on this first cluster of what is the state of civil society at national level, what is their role, how can states best leverage and use civil society as catalysts for positive change, and how can international mechanisms support that space at national level before we then turn into a kind of more close look at where we're at in terms of civil society space within the mechanisms. So the floor is open. Let's take a few questions to the panel, and otherwise I have some more follow-up questions already here. So please, sir. And then.
Good afternoon. Thank you for the panel. I'm Sultan Serveri, a student from France. I had a question from you. How the international community can help a country of post-conflict to make their civil society, and how can they help them for making some mechanism to arrange their civil society that they have a role to make the law and to enforce the law in the society? Thank you.
Thank you for this question. I have one in the back there, and then Sandra, or the other way around, doesn't matter. Sandra, go ahead.
Okay, thank you very much. Good afternoon. My name is Sandra. I'm with Franciscans International. I really appreciated a lot all interventions by the panel, but I just would like to come back to something that, well, Virginia will know is very dear to my heart and very close to my experience, but I worked a lot with, from the civil society side, with the Committee on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, and I think I really... it really struck me what Virginia was saying in terms of building these bridges between advocacy and service delivery organizations, especially when we talk about economic, civil, and economic, social, and cultural rights. Because I think it's up to and this link back with something Peggy Hicks said in terms of like this new kind of defenders who are usually not really identifying themselves, and civicus in the service know very well as well, but like land rights defenders, etc. And I think it's just about talking the structural issues behind what people have been doing in terms at times at very kind of practical service delivery level. So I think the committee there had a very important role. But for me, if I had one word to summarize summarize a bit what the committee and all committees, all treaty bodies have done is really to legitimize struggles and issues, because I think at the national level, people will have issues and raise these structural issues, asking for law reforms, etc. But whenever you come to Geneva, then the state is confronted with the fact that actually it is about human rights obligations. It is about international obligation. It's not about being against development. It's not being like some kind of terrorist or whatever and troublemakers, but it's about being in respect and in compliance with human rights obligation. And I think for me that would be really at the core. And I'm sorry, it's not a question, it's a comment.
Thank you. In the back, do you have a question? We're interested in questions here to the panel. No, that's fine.
Thank you very much, Emily from FIAN International. I have a question because a lot of the inputs were focused on how civic space is compromised specifically around human rights defenders and sort of personal security issues. I think this was brought up a little bit this morning, but I would be interested in your take on how you see civic space being compromised with the rise of multi-stakeholder platforms and the rise of large corporations sitting at the table with civil society organizations, and how that's changing the factors of participation, or maybe meaningful participation is shifting. I would be curious to hear how you see that at the national level.
Thank you very much. There's one question there in the back. I would like also some diversity. So, Madam, please.
Thank you very much. Thank you, the panelists, for the provocative ideas that you have put forward. I'm from the Gambia Mission. I've heard all the presenters, what they have said. The role of the civil society in the development of our countries, and in particular, the implementation of our national development plans is very important. And we can say, to an extent, restricting the civil society space differ from country to country. And I think we can all agree that we've been able to make some achievement in those areas. But I want to hear from the panelists, any one of you, how can we keep the civil societies also accountable, especially to the communities that they serve, especially where you're talking about an advocacy NGO and a service delivery NGO. And also, I think it's important for us to know, we want to know the demarcation of mandates. Where do we draw the lines when it comes to government and civil society interaction? Thank you.
Thank you very much. I know there's more hands. Maybe there will be time for a second interaction, so I'll come to you as a priority afterwards. Maybe I'll just rephrase Sandra's comment as a question, which I think implied in the legitimization is also a question of responsibility. So by making a struggle legitimate in the eyes of international human rights mechanisms, what responsibilities do those mechanisms also carry in order to then protect the people if, being more legitimate, more empowered, they actually start confronting political power at home? So maybe that's the question that was built in there. I'll leave it to the power of self-organization of the panel to make sure that we answer the four questions, maybe starting in the same order and going to you, Ambassador. 4 questions, any reflections and from the Irish experience. In particular, I think the question of how multi-stakeholder platforms affect civil society, and also how civil society remains accountable, I think are interesting ones to reflect on.
Well, I mean, I think well, there's 2 things that strike me. One, which isn't related to that, but just listening to the discussion and the conversation, it seems the SDGs give us a very good framework. Now, it's not perfect, but they give us a very good framework because they are all about connectivity. And it really strikes me sometimes listening to discussions here and thinking it through, that so many of us in our organizations and in the UN, we've got development and we've got human rights. And they're separate people a lot of the time, separate mechanisms, separate ways of thinking, and yet it should be clear to us that they are that we need to work together much more. Now that's why the Human Rights Defender resolution this year, this last session, was so important. And I see our colleague from Norway there, because environmental human rights defenders that's bringing together the two issues. When we work in development, we talk a lot about land rights. We've heard this mentioned, but still we tend to live in different worlds. So I think we need to grasp the SDGs a little bit more effectively to pull together our development and our human rights work. And the two communities often don't want to deal with each other. So I think that's something that really strikes me. Our civil society in Ireland, and it strikes me as well from our work with our aid programme, our development programme in Africa, that so often those on the ground doing development have to be listening to the voices of people on the ground who don't think this is a human rights issue or this is a development issue. They think this is a life issue. Our civil society at home is also split a little bit, in the sense that those looking at domestic issues such as homelessness and service delivery and advocacy, they're almost in a separate world to our development NGOs, who are very well funded by government. I mean, we fund them very well through our development programs, and there can be a sense there that that the development NGOs don't want to share so much of the attention and perhaps the funding with the domestic. And that again, I think, is where the SDGs are vital, because you have to look at not just your international obligations in terms of human rights, which are really important for governments to understand, but also your obligations in signing up to the SDGs at the national level and at the international level. But I think still, we look at government's lack of response. We also need to look at NGOs' lack of response. And I think the really important thing there is not to see civil society as the traditional NGOs alone. It's how you are empowering people, citizens, to mobilise maybe around one issue or to mobilise around a whole series of issues. And the accountability issue is important, but that will look after itself in a way in a democratic society, because elections are still going to be paramount. They will still have to be accountable in terms of the issues that are raised. And we found in government funding for NGOs that the issues of accountability had to be addressed, because NGOs felt themselves a little bit outside. There was no need to be accountable if you were taking the right side. So issues of accountability and governance for NGOs, as with any organisation, I think is also important, and to the benefit of the work of the NGOs and their credibility. But it's a bit of, for us in Ireland, it's a work in progress, because we were a society that were. Well, frankly, we were a post-colonial society, which then replaced the colonial sort of boss with big powers internally. For instance, the church and one or two political parties. Mm-hmm. So, in finding voice, people are only finding their voice, to be honest, in recent years. So a lot of these issues of debate are still very live.
Thank you, Ambassador. Susan, any reflections for you for our four interveners from the floor?
Thanks. The question from a colleague from FIA, and I think that was really interesting. You're asking about the power, or about this change or shift of when we have the private sector at the table, or when we talk about multi-stakeholder engagement. And it's an interesting, very interesting question, because we find, more and more that private sector, some of these transnational companies have bigger turnovers than the GDP of small countries. So they are wielding immense power. And when they come to that table, they come to the table with that immense power. And then you have civil society, and you have, of course, state, you have the power of the state, and then you have civil society at the same table. And these multi-stakeholder dialogues are supposed to be equal and participatory, but you have to take that into account, the power dynamics that are there, whether they're, overt or not. And so also another thing about the dynamic of the private sector is that we see, as we've spoken about environmental rights defenders and stuff, but we see that the private sector is one of the biggest actors in restricting civic space. So they are probably the predominant non-state actor in the restrictions of civic space. So they bring to the table these challenges, and then they don't have the same accountability mechanism. So they're not held to account in the Human Rights Council, for example, where we can hold states to account. So it does really, I would say, prove more challenging than opportunistic for civil society. Although we see at Civic is that because the private sector is such a large stakeholder, that it would be sort of detrimental not to engage, but not engage in that sort of way with this open kind of trust level, but engage with a very strong understanding of what the private sector is capable of and what they can do to the detriment of civil society. Thanks.
Thanks, Susan. Maybe we'll go to Peggy, because I know that especially with in the online space, there's a lot of private actors as well that you've been reflecting on how to include them.
Yeah.
So you may have reflections there, and then we'll come to Virginia.
No, it's interesting because Susan's comments really got me thinking. I think I agree with everything she said, but yet I would have said it very differently. And it's almost like the glass half empty, glass half full type of thing. To me, the private sector corporation, they've always been there. I mean, they've always been this huge influence. It's nothing new that they have that level of power. To me, I think part of what's happening now is that, we have seen with the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights and with other approaches that are happening through the SDG processes, there perhaps are new openings, new ways to actually try to address some of those power dynamics in new and different ways. Now, I don't want to play too positive a gloss on it because, as Michael said, I mean, we're working very much on the role, for example, of the tech companies, where, it is absolutely the case that the influence of a Facebook on our world today is very, very substantial and potentially very harmful if not handled better than it is currently being handled. The one thing I'd say is based on my experience coming from a civil society NGO setting, is that I actually find it's just two different tracks, but engaging with businesses can sometimes yield faster results and more effect than engaging with states. States, the power dynamics in states give we as civil society sometimes very few levers to change things in certain environments. With businesses, if there is a business case for what you're arguing, and to me, I think virtually everything we argue from a civil society engagement and civic space standpoint, we can make a compelling business case for. By business case, I mean just showing everybody why your business will be better off if it engages in a way that's supportive of rights. If we can do that, and alternatively, if we can show that there are substantial risks to reputation and to profitability, if you don't engage that way, we have real levers, and companies, unlike governments, can shift quite quickly to change their policies if they think there is a real risk. And so it's trying, I think part of it is getting us in the human rights community to better take up those opportunities and better to use that leverage that we have. And so I do think we, to some extent, have underinvested in how we take on corporations. We've done a lot to sort of look at the abuses that corporations in the extractive sector, for example, have wrought upon societies, but we have not, I think, done as much as we might to be able to leverage some of this in a way that shifts them. And I do think things like this corporate human rights benchmark that Aviva set up, efforts that are being done through the guiding principles. We're on the third stage now of an accountability and remedy project through the guiding principles. I think there are better tools there, and we need to do more to use them. And that includes the tech companies, where we're launching right now a project that's really looking at how some would like to say that the guiding principles just aren't really relevant to tech companies. They're just, we need something new, and everybody's coming up with lots of new things in the tech sector. But our argument is that, in fact, nobody's even really tried to apply the guiding principles to the tech sector effectively, and what we need to do is really look at what does causality mean? What does contribution mean in the context of technologies like social media, like facial recognition? And, how can we hold companies more accountable under the guiding principles, because they have committed to them already. So it does provide some useful leverage for us. And the last one word I'd say is that we haven't talked at all about the role of international financial institutions and the World Bank in particular, and I think there's plenty of room for us to answer the question by a further conversation on that score.
Felix, when is the next annual platform? We can have further conversations on that. Virginia, some reflections on you. There's some questions, including the one on civil society in post-conflict societies that is not yet been addressed, but obviously you're free to speak to all of the 4 questions.
Thanks, Mike. I just want to add to what you said to Felix. When you
microphone.
have anything on the IFIs, I want to be here, Felix, please, in the audience, because I think Portugal was one of the countries that was most dilapidated by the FIs. So if you allow me at that time, I'd like to sit in the audience. In relation to the post-conflict societies, one of the problems with building post-conflict societies, I think, is that in many transitional justice systems, it's only civil and political rights that matter. And very often, it eschews the whole effort. Because many times, if you look at pre-conflict alerts, they are also violation of economic, social, and cultural rights. And that then doesn't get picked up in the post-conflict recovery process. So what we've often said is that you have to be careful in all post-conflict resolution processes. You have to have pay strong attention to economic, social, and cultural rights, have all groups represented. For example, women are very often absent from all the efforts. So these are issues that we have been recommending to states, that you have to have transitional justice also in terms of building economic, social, and cultural rights. Now, in relation, I think Sandra put it much better than I did when she spoke of new kinds of defenders. I don't think I like the sound of it, but I don't think they're new, really. They've always been there. And I think what is important is not to create this distinction between only advocacy NGOs defending human rights. I think you need to broaden that understanding to know that other NGOs can also protect, promote, and help in fulfilling human rights. And I think that in terms of economic, social rights, it comes very clear because, like I said, most of the goods and services for the realization of economic, social rights are now at subnational level and very often by NGOs. So I think I've been working on it myself back home. I think that's a line to be pursued. You will never be able to undermine the role, or you will never be able. No one is trying to undermine the role of advocacy NGOs. What we're trying to say is that there is not a very clear kind of exclusion from NGOs defending human rights. Also, NGOs who fulfill human rights through goods and services that are accessible, that are available, that are of good quality, that respect non-discrimination, substantive equality, they can also contribute very much to the role of NGOs. I think that was what in terms of the large corporations, Peggy, thank you very much for reminding us of the UN guidelines. The committee also has a general comment on the role of states. And I think that is sometimes the missing link here. We talk of the contribution of the NGOs, of the private sector, we talk of the possibility of private sector helping to shrink space, but we forget sometimes in this equation of what the role of the state is. And I think that we need to keep in mind. The strengthening of the regulatory role of the state that is the final guarantor of justice, I think that's an important equation there. So sometimes we get a little bit, in between civil society and private sector, but the state has a fundamental role to play there. And I think the general comment 24 of the committee was useful in the sense that it opened up the discussion and brought the states very clearly into that equation. Of course, treaty bodies don't deal with private sector, but the state has the responsibility to protect from violations by third parties. And I think it fits very well with the role of the treaty bodies.
Thank you very much, Virginia. We'll stay with you as we launch into the second part, where we'll look more closely at how does this all play out in international spaces. And now, obviously, the topic or the key word that comes to mind immediately is this issue of reprisals and retaliation, adverse consequences on the people who communicate, cooperate with various UN human rights mechanisms. There may be service delivery NGOs at the basis, and then come to the treaty bodies to share their experience and by doing so expose themselves to criticism, to attack, to retaliation and reprisal. Now, the committee has been very active. As you've corrected me, the SESCR hasn't signed on to the San Jose guidelines, but has its own system to deal with reprisals. Can you tell us how the committee deals with it and whether this is sufficient?
Michael, yes, we do have a statement, but it's a statement on human rights defenders. And I must say the committee hasn't been very... I mean, we've had a couple of complaints on reprisals, but it hasn't really been a very strong component of our work. What I think is, based on my experience at the committee, I think there's a role here for the chairpersons of the treaty bodies to play. Anyone who's known me for a long time knows that I'm not an advocate for excessive harmonization. I don't think it's useful. I don't even think it's reasonable. I think there's now this whole thing that the harmonization of working methods will be the panacea for all the flaws of the system. I don't believe in that. But if there's one aspect where I think we need to act together and have a real strong, I would almost say mandatory approach, is in relation to reprisals. And I give you an example. When we have a complaint from an NGO that has just come to the committee and that when going back has had a problem at the national level, the committee is no longer in session. The treaty body may no longer be in session. And I don't think there is any reason why treaty bodies cannot have the same unified approach when something like this happens. Some will say, oh, we are not in session, so we'll have to wait for the focal point to contact this one, that one, the other. I think it's totally a loss of what relevance we can have. So I would say, in terms of the role of the chairperson's meeting, I think it's a very important issue. I know the office has worked on this report after the workshop on reprisals in December, and that is going to be discussed at the chairperson's meeting this year. I don't see why the chairperson's meeting cannot come up with a harmonized procedure in relation to reprisals. In my understanding, it should be an immediate letter sent to the country. Of course, we have to respect that time if the complainant wants privacy or not privacy. You have to deal with that. But then I always thought, and I've often said this, that that letter should be signed by the chairperson of the committee, by the focal point or the rapporteur for reprisals, and by the country rapporteur, because it reflects different levels of responsibility. And if that problem has happened to more than one committee, then you should have a joint letter, because it raises the visibility, it gives the potential victims better opportunities to defend themselves, and I think it sends a strong message to state. So I don't believe in excessive harmonization. I do believe in harmonization in terms of reprisals. Thank you.
Thank you very much for setting out very clearly. And now that you're no longer a member, we can see that you're an advocate. I'm turning to Ambassador Gaffey on this. The Human Rights Council, and again continuing this reflection on what more needs to be done. The Human Rights Council has adopted resolutions on cooperation with UN, etc., for 30 years. Reprisals are still happening. Some say they're increasing in severity in the number of incidents. What more can states do to increase the political cost of reprisals?
Well, we need to do. I think we need to do more. It's a very, as you say, it's a worrying issue, and it's getting more difficult. And I suppose what's worrying is, in a way, that reprisals are coming from a lot of different sources now. I mean, in the past, you would know exactly where the reprisals were going to be coming from. You knew the states that were responsible, and now it is broadening, and it is a phenomenon that is increasingly worrying. Now we're on the in the core group on reprisals, and it'll come up again shortly. And there is no secret that there is a real worry, because if you know, reprisals against people who are attempting to use the mechanisms of the United Nations, that is an affront to the United Nations and to all that we have signed up to. And yet the issue is sometimes a bit slow to get traction because of developments in the world around us. So I think it is really important that we stick to this issue. I think the fact that we now have, I mean, and these are relatively small things. We're talking about what we can do in the system here. But I mean, we have an interactive dialogue now with the Assistant Secretary General. Andrew Gilmore is really kind of working hard with very limited resources on the issue of reprisals. I think it is really important, though, that states, I mean, it's a very important point that Virginia made earlier about states. We have to at all time come back to the role of states. The states have human rights obligations. It's not an issue of how we interact always with others. In the end, states have a really important role to play. And I think what we have to do is to find, as states, the courage to call out other states when there are reprisals, be they seemingly small or large, because the reprisals are often, sometimes they might just seem an inconvenience. Other times they might seem a real threat to life and limb. And I wouldn't like to have a scale there whereby you say if it's just a mere inconvenience to somebody attending a meeting, it's not as important as a threat to life. And that, I think reprisals of any sort against people attempting to use the mechanisms need to be called out. And we have attempted to do so in UPRs. And in high-level segments and in making statements at the HRC. But it does require a determination to do so and a very conscious effort to do so, so that other political considerations do not intrude. And I think we need to keep a strong focus on reprisals because the situation at the moment, as I said, is worrying.
Thank you, Ambassador. Susan, let me turn to you. From a civil society perspective, I'm sure you share what was kind of built into the last sentence of Ambassador, that often we see that other political consideration trump, you know, the in principle interest of states to call out others when reprisals happen. What do you think is needed in order to overcome that impasse?
Thank you. And yeah, it's also been pointed out that reprisals are the greatest threat to the legitimacy of the Council and of the UN mechanisms and treaty bodies. I think one step further from what Ambassador said about states having the ability to call other states out is to actually raise specific cases in that dialogue so that it's not just a kind of, you can get away with reprisals, we're going to call you out for reprisals, but to raise the specific cases, and that will increase the political cost quite significantly, I think. And then another thing, just to build on that, is just some more transparency in the follow-up mechanisms to the cases of reprisals so that we can see what's happening. Is it a political issue that's stopping the follow-up mechanism from taking place?
Thank you, Susan. Now, turning over to you, Peggy, having heard what, from the state perspective, Ambassador Gaffey thinks is necessary, what Susan is wanting to see from civil society perspective, how is OHCHR thinking about cracking this nut of reprisal? What's new? Are there new efforts in other spaces that you can inform yourself by? What's the next plans in terms of really putting an end to reprisals?
Thanks very much, and some will have seen me smile when Ambassador Gaffey referred to the limited resources. We have one of those resources with us, Lola Infantad, who is one of the two staff people who work with Andrew Gilmore on that mandate. And let me tell you, and thanks to ISHR and many others who helped that mandate come into being, if you ever had any doubt about its usefulness, let me tell you, I think Lola and her colleague Taran are two of the most overworked people in the office, given the amount of demand there is for that mandate and for it to do more and more. And one of the things we talked about on the way over is how it's also, the more it does, the more space there is for it to do more. So the report that they do on a yearly basis as an SG's report, continually grows. Because unfortunately not that many cases get resolved, more cases happen, but also we're doing all sorts of outreach and engagement. They just did a workshop in Kenya And we're, through all of that activities, more comes to the office, which is a very good thing. But it does mean that, it requires more resources if we're actually going to be able to meet up with that demand. A couple of points about how we can do better. One is that as much as I agree that we need to do a better job on the individual cases, I do worry sometimes that the case-based approach is never going to get us there. And the reality is that we need to find a way to move beyond the individualized cases to make sure that we're addressing the more systemic issues that underlie those cases. And I think sometimes it's easier, as hard as it is to talk about the cases, it's easier to talk about the cases than the overall lack of rule of law or accountability that allows governments to engage in the way that they do. It's not enough to solve an individual case if the system that created that case is still in place and if the deterrent or chilling effect that was caused by that case doesn't change as well. So we need to make sure we're always working on both tracks. We will continue to actively pursue the case-based approach, but we also need to look at and get more engagement on the systemic and structural issues that allow reprisals to happen. And with that, I'd say the point I most often make about this is about the state's role. And I do think it's very difficult to get states to engage on reprisals, despite the fact, as Ambassador Gaffey very eloquently said, this is not an issue about you helping them. It's about you helping yourself. Because the reality is, if there's a reprisal against someone who's trying to work with a UN mechanism, that is an attack on the mechanism. It's an attack on the system that the states themselves have put in place. And states ought to see it as something that is directed, that they have an interest in. It's not, they're not a third party. They're an active participant in this if they don't engage. I think part of the problem with states is that they tend to see it as either we say something or we don't type of dilemma. And, and they have so many issues on their plate, they're not necessarily going to want to, for political purposes, make this one of their top priorities in a session. But I think there's so much more that states could do, to broaden that toolbox. I've talked with states about the need to be able to go one-on-one and talk to ambassadors when you're concerned about something that has happened. That's an easier recourse than taking it up in a public statement. But I think I've heard from ambassadors that when they've heard repeatedly about things, it does start to have an impact as well. So, that's just an example, but I think we need to broaden that toolbox of what states are responsible for doing. And, we've got a core group, but why, core group of 5, 6, what is it? How many are there of you now? Anyway, small core group. We could have a bigger group of states that had a much more delineated commitment of what they will do on each reprisal case, that they will work through that toolbox. If you're a member of the core group, you've got to be willing to do that. If you're a member of this broader commitment, you've got to be willing to do that. So look at how we can improve the role of states more. As I said, and I won't go into it in depth, we're also looking at how the UN itself can be much more consistent on this across the system. The special procedures and treaty bodies, I think, have been quite good overall, but there's ways to do more, as Virginia has said. But, I do think we can ratchet that up, but I do think we are inconsistent across the UN in terms of the level of profile and engagement these cases get, and we need it to be more vigorous across the system. And then finally, just because it seems we're giving Felix another job, we need to talk about the IFIs again. Michael pointed out to me, and I'm glad he flagged it, that there is work going on with regards to compliance mechanisms within, for example, the IFC has, for the first time, done a standard statement on reprisals and is engaging quite strongly on some of these issues. But the extent to which those efforts have traction within the actual institutions themselves, they're often set up as separate offices, and they can be undercut by, the ombudsperson can be undercut by the organizational structure too. So it's something where there are some elements there that I think have some potential to make an impact, but they need a lot more visibility and support for them to have that impact.
Thanks, Peggy, for pointing out some of the strategies that we could apply to move beyond the current impasse with regards to combating reprisals. We've got 13 minutes left, I think, before the end of this panel. So very quick questions. Floor is open, and then we'll give our panelists an opportunity to respond. Got Peter here, Madam there, and then gentleman here. Another gentleman. Monsieur, ça vous va? Peter, please.
Thank you, Michael. Mine's perhaps a comment as much as a question. But when I see that governments go after special procedure mandate holders personally, at threats, not just criticizing or disagreeing, and the council says nothing public, there's nothing visible, no reaction, I can't help but wonder, doesn't that undercut the council's effectiveness on reprisals? Because if it doesn't take care of its own mechanisms, and I agree completely with what you say, Peggy, an attack on someone who's come to the council, or reprisal, is an attack on the council. But if it doesn't, and is it seen to take care of its own mechanisms, what's it really going to do for people who aren't quite as close?
Thanks. So how does the council protect its integrity in the face of attacks on special procedures? Madame?
Khadija from MENA Rights Group. We're a small NGO which engage regularly with all special procedures, with the SGNU reprisal report, but I'm wondering now, to what extent do you think that all the forms of reprisals that take place before, during, and after engagement can be articulated in a more holistic way? I explain. So before civil society could actually come and engage with the UN, we need to look into cybercrime laws that forbid them from engaging on the cyberspace, or other laws related to association that from the very beginning act as obstacles to the engagement. And then during their engagement here in Geneva, multiple actors have been either directly threatened by representatives of their states, or, and this is a new trend, during briefings, during civil society briefings to treaty bodies especially, we have more and more NGOs which are not independent, which have been created by the state that is being reviewed, and who have their place during these pre-session briefings. And so some treaty bodies have elaborated sort of an official pre-session briefing with only a limited amount of NGOs that can be trusted, but still there is this issue of identifying those who have been sent by the state in order to listen to what NGOs are saying. And after, once the NGO worker or activist goes back home, then there is the whole issue of reprisals. So this is what I mean by a holistic approach here. It's not only individual cases, it's also, as you said, right, as you pointed rightly, the issue of laws that are incriminating or constituting an obstacle, but also taking into account all the different venues and all the different branches of this big tree that is reprisals, from the rooms of the Palais Wilson to the Human Rights Council. And I was wondering, to what extent do you think this can be thought in a more holistic way?
Thank you.
Thank you.
The question around the kind of the life cycle of the repression and the reprisals, and I think it connects also to the first part of our panel, and maybe Peggy has some answers. Monsieur?
Having bad hearing, I am not sure this is the right moment to ask the question, but I'll try. I am 72 years old, and I don't want to die without getting the answer to some basic questions, which I often ask, but since I am a journalist, I'm very slow-minded, I never could get clearly the reply. Who qualifies for civil society? Do political parties, unions, media, business qualify, or is it a deposited label by NGOs? That's my first question. The second one, what would the members of the tiers état of the 17th century think if they knew that 2 or 3 centuries later, even after the Chiesetta has taken over established democracy with even 3 estates, we still need a new Chiesetta because political parties, elected government, unions, and the like are not enough to represent the people. And my third question is inspired by Karl Popper. He could not attend, but he called me, and I never could get what is the uncivil society.
Thank you for this last set of questions, some of which we may be able to answer, others we'll have to take outside. I'd like to invite the panels, maybe starting in the order that they started, to give us their final reflections. And if I may add a question of my own, if we were sitting here again in a year's time, what would you, in your respective functions, have done so that civil society is a little bit more protected from reprisals than it is today? So with that and the remaining questions, I'll leave it to you, Ambassador, to give us your final reflections.
I think what we really need to do is to, I mean, okay, I'm a representative of a state, and what we really need to do is link, we've got our principles and we've got our policy approaches, but we really need to link up much more effectively how we operate in different spheres. That's at home, in the Human Rights Council, and through our missions around the world, through our embassies around the world. And that's that whole issue of something happens in Geneva, the human rights defender or the activist or just the NGO member goes back home and is then quietly or not so quietly mistreated or intimidated. And I think I think we need to do more in calling out states and in talking to ambassadors, as Peggy says, here in Geneva. But I think we also need to bring it more into the work of our embassies in capitals, so that they can not just raise issues. The big debate is always, do you raise human rights and human rights issues when you discuss trade? And we've discussed this at great length, and at least we've now reached the point where the human rights situation is a legitimate area raised by many countries. But I think our missions also need to be in contact with those we see as human rights defenders. And the more that embassies are in direct contact with them, the more they're going to be effective, and the less that they can be picked off. So in various capitals, I think we need to be more effective in linking our embassies up with the work that we're doing here in Geneva. And that would likewise, I'd say, to go back to my other point, that would in our various development programs, I think again we need to be much more linked up between what we do here in Geneva and what is happening on the ground. And when it comes to civil society and what it is and who it is and how we define it, I wouldn't worry about that. If you have a functioning, healthy, developing democratic society, you're not going to worry too much about how you define the different voices that are being heard. The point is that the voices need to be heard, and people need to feel free to make their voices heard. And in the end, if you're a democratic society, the parliament will be decided by vote, but the issues will be raised at local and community level. And it's part of a healthy democratic society, so I wouldn't worry too much about the definitions. But I think, finally, to say, in a year's time, I'm afraid to say, we're going to be facing the challenges that we face now, and we're going to need to be a little bit more determined in addressing them, because the tide is going in the other direction internationally. So it does behove us to think through how we put our policy approaches into practice and into voice here in Geneva, and how that then is reflected in countries around the world where we are represented, where we can be more effective.
Thank you, Ambassador, and obviously the September session will be an opportunity specifically on reprisals.
It certainly will.
Susan.
Thank you. I'll attempt to answer the question on civil society and what constitutes civil society by using Civic as its own definition, which is civil society exists outside of the state and the private sector. So we would exclude the state and the private sector, but it includes anybody working together towards a just and equitable society. So that can include opposition political parties as long as they're not part of the state mechanism yet. So, for example, freedom fighters or something like that. We also, in our definition, go much broader than most. We include individuals, we include faith-based organizations, clubs, things like even your Girl Guides would be qualified as a civil society organization. And then conversely to that, you asked about what uncivil society is. And for us, that would be then groups that are anti-rights. So they are against anti-rights groups. So they would be against a just and equitable society. For them, their rights would cause an unequal society. So you have many groups fighting for a specific right, but in their fight, they are creating a more unequal society. I hope that sort of helps you a little bit with at least how Civicus approaches those questions. So thank you. Yes, absolutely. And it will carry on, I'm sure.
Thank you very much, Susan, for shedding some light here. Virginia, your concluding responses.
I just want to take up the issues that colleague raised in terms of NGOs who come to the treaty bodies and who are not in the right spirit. And I think, first of all, it does happen, but I think you need to credit the treaty bodies also with some kind of possibility to understand where the reality lies. And therefore, we listen to many things, to many NGOs, but we know, I think we've been more or less accurate in deciding which are the views that are conducive to our relationship with the NGOs and the states, and not to the others who represent hidden objectives, if I may say so. Now, in terms of this whole holistic cycle that you said, you know, one of the things we've seen happen lately is the use of the webcast, and how in many countries the UN space, which is the country teams or any one of the agencies who takes a leading role, has been able to organize a space during the dialogue where civil society can listen, where they can interact among themselves. And I think it's a very practical suggestion, because then it makes it very difficult for the state to take any retaliatory measure, because it's a safe space, it's the UN space, and it provides for a kind of an open space where NGOs can participate. So it has worked very well. In the case of the committee, we've had these interactions with a number of countries in Latin America, and it has worked very well. In relation to uncivil society, I would just like to add one thing, which is not really academic, but which is the understanding we have now of these societies that are becoming so divisive in terms of us and them, and everyone who's not us is someone who comes to take away what we have. I think that is what an uncivil society is. And I hope that 1 year from now, we'll be able to have a slightly more optimistic approach, because I think sometimes you need to hit rock bottom before you start coming up again. So when sometimes I hear people say, this is not the right time, not conducive for human rights, I can think of other times when it was not conducive to human rights. And I think it just depends on each and every one of us to be able to make these potentially uncivil societies understand that's not the way they're going to gain over terrorism and extremism and violence, etc. Thank you.
They won't, and thanks for leaving us with that note. Peggy.
Yes, another good glass half full person on my left, and I do think, I mean, our former High Commissioner often made the point about, you know, what was the birthplace of the UN human rights system, and the UN itself, of course, is in the wake of exactly those sorts of uncivil moments. So just two quick comments on Peter's very excellent point about the special procedures themselves being under attack, and what message that sends to those who want to engage with those mechanisms or with others, and how we address it. I mean, I think you're absolutely right to say that we have to devote even more attention to making sure that there is a vigorous response when those attacks occur. I have to tell you that, given that my branch also does the secretariat function for the special procedures, I find it to be a very difficult space to work in, because even the states that are the most supportive of that system do find it very difficult when their own country is the subject of allegations or communications even from special procedures. And, you know, we're doing our best to make sure that we have a level playing field, but part of it is simply the political impact of it. Even when states sort of realize, oh no, it's a perfectly valid question, we understand why they're asking it, or a criticism that we ought to be willing to take, the difficulty of being in government and being the one taking that type of attack is quite difficult. And it's made me think about what we can do to rectify that, to put the burden, to put real life into what I've always said to these governments when they come to me, which is, actually, this is your best shining moment, because you can show what real commitment to human rights means by the way you respond to these things. And even if you don't agree with them, if you respond in a respectful, substantive way, that's exactly what will shine through, you know, in that. But I do think we all have an obligation to make that statement more meaningful. And that does mean civil society and other groups coming forward to really demand more from their own governments when special procedures engage with them, and recognizing the governments that do it better than others, and giving some credit that even if every state has human rights violations happening, those states that are willing to engage more effectively with special procedures should get a bit more credit for that as well. So that's sort of the flip side to the coin of trying to make sure that we defend the special procedures themselves. And the only thing I'd say on the final comment about, you know, how we look at civil society and the role of this broader civic space, I think we have to really focus, as the other questioner said, on that more holistic approach that will allow us to really engage across the spectrum of the issues that will be confronted. And we did talk about this on the way over here as well, that the reprisals issue, as I said, cannot be solved without looking broadly at civic space. And the cybercrime example is a perfect one, because ultimately it does, I do think one of the things that has really changed, and I will again convey the message that unless we in conference rooms like this grapple with it, it will be to our detriment. One thing I'd like to see happen in the next year is that we bring that digital and online dimension more into this conversation, because it is where a lot of this battle is being fought, and we have to get better at fighting it there. Thank you.
Thank you, Peggy, and thank you, Ambassador Gaffey, Susan, Virginia, for all the great contributions today. Unfortunately, we're out of time, but there's a generous coffee break happening afterwards, so there's 25 minutes that you have to talk to any of us, talk amongst yourself. I hope you've been able to take at least one thing that you're going to implement in your year to come from all of your perspectives, so that when we meet again in a year's time, civil society has more space at national level and is safer in engaging with international human rights mechanisms. If you're still short of ideas, go to our website or speak to us. We have plenty of them. Thank you very much.